Goodbye, 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 goodbye number one. Goodbye, 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 goodbye number two. Goodbye, 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 goodbye number three. Goodbye, 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 goodbye number four. Hold up your hand if you love her, then your fashion and style.
It's what's been interesting throughout all of the descriptions of what people do. It's almost quite clear where their ethnicity or their backgrounds kind of link into the path that they've taken. But the question that I would kind of like to put out there is, do you think that, and perhaps I feel like I know the answer to this already, but it'd be interesting to explore it. Do you think that your background has in any way kind of hindered or made your process happen a little bit kind of later in time than it could have done given the talent?
Well, I'm going to kick off, I guess, so we can move
Sure.
down the line. Look, first of all, my family is from a village. We're very feudal, agricultural, very, very far removed from the big metropolitan centres. I didn't grow up in cities. My first memories are of bamboo shacks and all the other places along the various borders, and living in army towns and tents often. So I think that's part of the issue, because I think when we talk about ethnicity, we forget there are elements of class, geography, history, all of those play a part. So when I did write my first novel, it was an interesting process back in the 90s where it was seen as too weird, as one of the Indian editors told me in Delhi. He said, "There's way too much sex and drugs in here." Fair enough. Weirdly enough, it was echoed by various British editors who said, apparently Indian women don't write about sex and drugs. Weirdly enough, gets worse. One of the reviewers then proceeded to talk about promiscuous sex, and I went, my poor character had sex with 2 men. That's promiscuous? So there you go. I think that kind of plays a part, doesn't it? Not at the same time. But I think that's very much part of it, you know, what is seen as Indian enough or not enough. I mean, that's kind of what Kavita talks about. Yeah. It's also, I mean, right now I've got a new novel out. It has a woman journalist as a protagonist. I know some great journalists from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, who just do amazing work. But when we think of stories, you know, that's not who we think of. So it's a strange process, because I think it would have been easier if I had signposted her in ethnically acceptable terms. So if I had talked about forced and arranged marriages, if I talked about, you know, lots of cooking recipes from Indian kitchens and extended families, I would have probably been better off with it. Yeah. But because
there would have been a market for it.
Yeah, there isn't a market for, well, there is a market, I've realized, since the book has come out 8 weeks ago. So you just have to get it to the readers. But it is a problem, because you're kind of, the gatekeepers don't see that there's a space for those kind of stories.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't feel that anything in my life happened earlier than it could have, because I've had a career since I was 14. I don't think I could possibly do it any earlier. And believe me, if I could have done it, I would have. But I didn't have the wherewithal to do it before my 14th birthday. But I wanted to pick up on what Sunny just said, because it's absolutely true. And the background, of course, isn't just about race; it's also about privilege, and because of the entitlement, which is like totally obvious, and it would be disingenuous to say otherwise. I could succeed because part of what entitlement is that mannerism of knowing that you can rub along with people and the confidence to do it. But I was very careful right at the beginning of my career to not be ghettoized, because if you go to a newspaper editor and you say, I want to write about how my parents do something, my father is very tyrannical, and my mother just makes pokora in the kitchen, I don't know what this stories about me, and she just wants me to get married, they would love that. And you would write that, and that would be you for the rest of your career. And that would also be the end of your career, and it's also not true. So you have to avoid these stereotyped, ghettoized narratives. But what's strange 22 years into my career is seeing that the level of representation, despite, for example, London being so incredibly diverse in many different ways, hasn't really changed. So when I was 14 or 15, I was one of, say, 10 names that you could mention, and 22 years later, it's still the case. If you look at publishers, if you look at radio broadcasters, not foreign correspondents, but sort of domestic broadcasters, if you look at newspaper coverage, it's still incredibly undiverse in terms of class, race and sex and that great matrix of privilege which you can put together. And in publishing specifically, there still is a certain number of contracts. If you want to write about how I did or didn't become a terrorist, or almost became a terrorist, but not quite, how I became a female suicide bomber / jihadi bride, that would do really well.
Who's promiscuous?
Who's promiscuous? Better yet, a lesbian, Syrian lesbian, jihadi bride. So if you wanted a novel called Silks and Spices, Saffron and Musk, or something like that.
I'm getting home right now.
Or like a novel, or red dust novel, like a woman in a village setting with some dust behind her, or like a woman with some coal and a veil looking a bit sad. So there's a host of opportunities if you wanted to play to the cliche. But if you said to people the cliche is much more complicated, it's like they're not willing to accept that because the cliche is so much easier. And of course that's tied in with privilege and colonialism and racism. When you get down to it, if you scratch away all the polite diplomatic things we're saying, this is about race and racism.
Yeah, I agree totally with what has been said by both writers before me. The thing is though, I mean, it's difficult because in my first novel, I decided to fully engage with those stereotypes. I said, you know what, I'm going to write about those people because A, that was my background. That's where I came from. I lived on an estate in West London and I knew people who were from estate backgrounds and we did naughty things, lots of naughty things. And some people would have termed my mates, who I grew up with, who I knew very well, as gangsters because they did gangsters things and they ended up in prison. A friend of mine, her son just died in prison last week, I found out the other day. So this is real, this actually happens, this goes on. For me as a writer and someone an artist and someone who's surveying that territory, it was about me being able to take that on and actually depict A, the beauty in that place, yeah, which is really important, but B, the humanity of those people who were there, actually, to show, okay, that's not all they are. They do these things, but what's the reason? Why do they do it? How do they get into it? How do they feel about it emotionally? What is their journey? Do they oppose it or do they embrace it? And so I chose to write about those things. In the knowledge that that would be the accepted story, that was the acceptable story. It doesn't negate anything that's being said here. Actually, my career is a testimony that they're right, in the sense that that was the stories that they wanted. They were the crack and gun stories. All I could do as an artist was to try and depict that humanity and do it well, do it in the best way I could. I mean, I was 21, 23 when the book was published, so I did it as well as I could then. Now I look at it with horror. But I tried, to get that across, and I think that's what reviewers said, that basically the most apparent thing about that community was love. The love they had for their area, the love they had for their friends, the love they had for their mothers and their fathers and stuff like that. And that's what I wanted to talk about, because that's what I saw. Later on, when I decided, okay, I don't want to be pigeonholed, I don't want to be in that box, I'm not going to let that define me, that's when things got a little bit tougher. But I really feel as an artist that that's what I'm supposed to talk about. And I continue to talk about it to this day. I still write about those people, albeit in different ways, but I try and write different things as well. And I try and attack that kind of framework from a slightly different angle and turn it slightly. So it's weird. Now I feel like I'm all for embracing the reality behind those stereotypes, as well as trying to then challenge those stereotypes by writing something completely different, so completely far away from that it's unrecognizable. And I really believe that we have to do both things, in a sense, if that's what we want to do as artists. I feel like I shouldn't feel that I can't tell a story about working class people from a council estate because publishers seem to be like, oh yeah, wet themselves for those stories. I mean, slightly less than they did at the time when that was happening, because those people are out there just now. Look, I mean, there's police out there, there's a group of young girls who are arguing with these guys in the shop as we were talking, And those people are human beings, those people deserve their stories being told. It's still out there. Yeah.
Still
I mean, this is happening whether we like it or not, and I worry sometimes about, and I'm not saying that was what's being said because it wasn't. I know that for a fact. But sometimes I've been in the room where people have been saying stuff like, "Oh, we need to write about more middle class people. We need to be writing," and I'm just like, but those are legitimate voices. And when I've worked in prisons and stuff, people have said to me, "Please keep writing about us because then we get seen, then our stories are told."
Thanks. I think I would very much agree with what Courttia just said. With the anthology, Too Asian, Not Asian Enough, and the work I've done since then, I think that the tendency I've seen is very much understandable, but for a lot of writers to kind of want to go in the not Asian enough camp in terms of Asian, but also just to avoid the stereotypes by writing about where we come from sometimes or our identities at all. So a lot of writers have said to me again and again, I'm not a British Asian writer, I'm just a writer. And as far as I can understand that in the British context, to be a writer is not something neutral. Actually, to be a writer is to be white, male, middle class. So if we don't actually interrogate that, we will end up writing like a white male middle class writer. So I think those identity labels are problematic when they're imposed from outside, but actually they have a role to play in terms of us trying to write our stories and be true to our stories. Maybe what we need to do is say that you need to say, you can identify as a white writer, for example, or a male writer, or we can break down our identities. So I could also say I'm a Punjabi writer because that specific region has a lot to do with where I come from in my writing. So you asked about the journey of writing and whether it's been a hindrance, and I'd actually say it's been a journey, political journey, a personal journey in trying to write this never-ending novel that has now turned, and I've been writing it for about 13 years. Actually, 10 years ago, Courttia read some of it because I did an Arvon course, and he must be thinking, oh my God, is she still writing that story? When will she finish? But weirdly, I haven't been in any kind of rush because I've started it again and again over the years. I leave it for a few years, and I've learned so much because those early drafts which you read were really problematic, and it's something I talk about in my introduction to my anthology, touching on what Sunny was saying earlier. Actually, my family, we have arranged marriages in our family. We wear saris. My novel is about a guru, which is the most cliched subject you can possibly get. But it's what I want to write about because that's the background and that's where I come from, and I don't want to avoid it by escaping from that. So the early drafts, I realized as I kind of grew and changed and lived in India for 5 years that I was writing like a white writer, or I had that kind of white gaze and I was looking down, and a lot of it was to do with what I was reading. So I think it's really important for us to read critically, otherwise you absorb that way of looking. So I was making fun of the characters, the world I was writing about. It was quite misogynistic what I was writing. So actually it's been a process of seeing what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And that's why it's been important for me, alongside my fiction writing, part of which has been going deeper into my history and the Punjabi side, the religion, the politics, caste, Khalistani politics, has also been a part of it is to look at the politics of writing, which is what my academic writing has been about. So to look at what's out there and see what it's doing and why it's doing that and how it's doing it, as a kind of clearing the ground before I can tell my story, because there's a lot of overlaps with the contemporary writers that I'm reading, Punjabi, working class origin, and a lot of people will read those works and think, oh yeah, that's about my life and that's about my past, and I would think that too. But then when you read them more closely, you realize that they're actually pro-assimilation, they're about progress, they're about leaving that behind, it's about how backward and irrelevant those families and communities are. So we need to understand why they do that and how they do that before we can tell our own stories, I think. So this is partly why it's taken me so long. I've now got a draft of one novel, but I still feel like there's still more time and I'm writing that.
Yeah,
Could I just pick up on something Courttia said, because it was really in support of what you said, about the importance of nuance, that of course there's someone from the outside writing a gangster novel, and there's someone who actually knows what they're talking about. And I wanted to bring that up in reference to the film that's out at the moment called Girlhood. Has anyone seen it? Have you seen it? Go and see it, because it's been trumpeted as this really great representation of what it's like to be Black Parisian young women growing up in the banlieue, the projects outside Paris. And I saw it and it struck me as one of the most racist things I'd ever seen in my life. It represents young Black female Parisians as every sexist, racist cliche you can ever think of. So you name it. Junkies, thieves, liars, aggressive, mouthy, no sense, teenage muck, with none of what you're saying, which is a nuance. You meet these 4 girls and you know their first names, and for an hour and a half of the film, you know nothing more about them whatsoever. And the whole message is the only way you can progress is not if you make friends with all these people in the banlieue and they're actually human beings, but if you escape. And that's the ultimate message of the film, which is that this is a horrible place, these are horrible people, all of these Black and brown men, they're all sexual abusers, all the women are going to have babies by the ages of 13, 15, they're all going to fight with each other, they can't shut up, they don't know how to behave. They get angry at being followed around the shops, being thought of as thieves, and then in the next shot you realise they're wearing these stolen dresses that they're dancing in. And I'm sort of absolutely beggared by the fact that this is being celebrated as a great film about race. And it isn't written, and it isn't written and directed by anyone who knows anything about it. By Celine Sciamma, who was a director that I love. There are many things to like about the film. You know, it has a novelistic structure, but in terms of its race politics, it's like, you know, sorry. I had to get that out. I was like, it was bubbling up when Courttia was talking. I had to
No, absolutely, and I think that's also, I think that was going to lead on to the next question, and something that I'm never sure about. It's like when I write about race politics, my relationship with The Independent has always been that they ignore every picture I send them until they want to wheel out the kind of the brown woman that they can put against the white woman. And that is always the way, and it was always manipulated in a way where I had a real horrible incident with one where I pitched something about kind of race politics and feminism, and they held on to my article for a week, got one of their white female journalists, who shall remain unnamed, to write a response piece to my piece, but then presented her piece as the first piece and mine as the response to hers. Because we are ultimately always, as brown people, responding to white people. That is always the narrative, and it was really appalling. And that's one side of it where it's really important to kind of I felt like I was othering myself in my career. That I had kind of put myself into this box. But then the other side of it is that this is exactly what the comment that you were making, which is that it's really important to tell these stories and to tell them, because there is a level of you know, I don't want to write, as you said, you know, there are enough white men writing as white men that we don't have to do their jobs for them. So this leads on to my next question. When we do talk about our ethnicity, our background, our otherness, so to speak, which is relevant, which is important, how do we do this without becoming a part of the cliche and without kind of furthering our own otherness as writers? I know that it's been touched upon in parts in the comments that we've been made, but maybe if we can, if there are any...
Can I just say, I don't actually have an answer to that.
No, I didn't think any of us would, actually.
In the first sense, the only thing I think for myself I can do is try to concentrate on the things that interest me as a reader, first and foremost, because, you know, I'm going out to bookstores and I'm finding books and saying, wow, does this spark some kind of an interest in me, an emotion in me, and then by after that, then what I want to write about. And I suppose for me, I feel like all I can do is just continue along this path, you know. And if some of the things that I want to write about fall into, you know, stereotypes or cliches, as long as I'm trying to present that in the nuanced way that we were talking about earlier, and I should be okay. But it's really important for me to feel like I have freedom as an artist to be able to just talk about what it is I want to talk about. So I try not to give myself any boundaries. I check myself. That's not to say that if I fall into, I'm going to, erring towards sexism or something like that, I don't say, hey, actually we need to, because that won't be the 360-degree view that I'm talking about. So I have to be wary about that. So it's not like, publishing me damned, you know what I mean? I can say whatever the hell I like because I'm a black guy and that's what I want to say, and that's enough, you know what I mean? It's not that, but it's more like, okay, being a living, breathing, feeling artist, how do I tell these stories? How do I get my point of view across in a way that is balanced and fair and doesn't hurt people as well? It doesn't hurt people as well. So I mean, it's a difficult one. Because we're always going to. Because we're seen as other, I think then we're always going to be othering ourselves by talking about issues to do with race, issues to do with class, because we're not going to be seen as the norm. But
sorry to interrupt, but until we find a platform that it stops that platform isn't othered anymore, then that becomes the norm.
When it becomes irrelevant. But also when we can celebrate that, actually, we can say these are the good things, these are the brilliant things about coming from our position, then that will hopefully change things as well. And then in turn other people can celebrate it too.
Mm-hmm. I want to actually go back and answer that in a slightly different way. I started writing, let me rephrase it. I started telling stories as a kid, basically by writing myself into stories that I would read and say, I don't agree with this, I'm going to write myself in, or I will write another narrative. Now, what that means is that I write the kinds of stories I want to read. Now, if that means it's a political stance, possibly yes. And I think it's been a political stance even before I could articulate it as that. So, for example, where are the queer men of color in the debate about equal rights? Yeah. Where are the queer women of color in the debate about equal rights? We never see that. Really what we've been getting is a middle-class version of marriage. Let's celebrate the most conservative institution in the world as this somehow great progressive thing. Now, what I want to do is write stories about people who don't make that straight. Now, is that a cliche? Sometimes I may have to go past it, but really all I do is I look around and I say, who are the people I admire? There are men of color, but as well as white men, who have an enormous amount of courage that I've always been fascinated by. Not the kind of guns and bombs kind, but this very quiet, inward looking. And I want to write about it. I'm very, very clear that there is in all the stories we're told, women of color are always oppressed and badly treated by men of color. They're never treated badly by white men. Strangely enough, that structural problem that I understand as an intellectual is something that will show up in my writing. Now, if I refuse to engage with it, I'm being a hypocrite, and I'm also being unethical. But I think for me, the question is slightly different, which is, I don't other myself, whether we like it or not. People of color are the majority across the world. My readers are not in Britain necessarily. My readers are across the world, and when they want to read it, they find me. And I think that's where, for me, the difference needs to go. Not sort of, let's not try to batter down doors which really aren't that interesting anyway.
Yeah. Just really quickly, sorry to take up, I don't want to take up too much time, but just that includes us kind of as artists as well, engaging outside of the box ourselves. So like when you say where are the queer writers of colour, I mean I think instantly of Dorothea Smart, who's writing that narrative. I think of Ricky Beadle Blair, the playwright, who's writing that narrative. When you talk about why do we always see men of colour oppressing women of colour. I think about writers like Edward P. Jones in America, who writes about, very sensitively about men and of colour and their relationship with women of colour. I think about those kind of writers as well. Colson Whitehead. There's all sorts of writers out there who are doing that work, and I think it's really important that we as artists kind of celebrate those people and introduce them to a wider reading public as well.
There's also Roxane Gay, who wrote The Bad Feminist, An Untamed State. But for me, this is also, it's political and it goes way wider than publishing. So in the UK, the number of books which come into translation into English from other languages is something like 3%. It's so little. It's a bit like saying that sort of Western audience, this is a cliche but it's true, don't like foreign films that have got subtitles. If you look in Germany, up to 40% of books in the German book market are translated from other languages, and that's huge, and that's exactly as it should be. So there's a very odd thing that happens in England. There's an incredible tolerance and an incredible insularity, all somehow mixed up together, and I've never quite got to the bottom of it because I think it's really unique. But I also feel that something is happening culturally which goes really wide, which is an increasing insularity, an increasing move to the right, an increasing move away, not just from all these brown, black, yellow and red people far, far, far away who are all barbarians and bombers and jihadis and all this other stuff that they don't want to think about, but even from the rest of the EU. We should never be talking about leaving the EU ever. I mean, it's an ideal, it's not just an economic construct. So I feel like in the last 5 to 6 to 7 years, this increasing sort of sense of hunkering down and developing the island mentality has arisen. It's almost as though in the kind of breakdown of the colonial role, so you're no longer colonial oppressors, so what do? You can do one of two things. You can become more insular, or you can say, okay, look, we're part of a world community here. We need to learn multiple languages. We need to get with the idea that the only possible peace is to make friends with people from other countries, and I don't just mean like France and Germany and Italy, I mean the other countries. But it seems as though the government or cultures in general have taken the first option, and I find it really actually frightening. And I feel that it doesn't just go for book publishing. I think it's sort of in the air, the cynicism about the rest of the world.
Yeah, for sure.
I agree with what you're saying. I think for me, I kind of feel that I've got my hands full enough just trying to go deeper and deeper, and I know this is very unfashionable, into a very specific identity. So I can't think about the world, and partly when you talk about writing in other languages, I kind of think that's very important too. And for me, it's been, we were talking about avoiding cliches, engaging with Punjabi language literature, for example, and seeing that as a tradition which I am building on because I'm writing so much about Punjabis in Britain or in India. So one of the ways is to, rather than only engaging with English language literature, to engage with Punjabi literature present day, but also going back to the poetry which has always been there and part of my upbringing, and it's been it is my culture, but because when you're brought up in Britain, educated here, media, literature, everything is telling you that's not actual real culture, that doesn't count, and I internalised that. So partly it's been about owning that and going deeper into that. Another way for me to avoid the cliches has been to think about who I'm writing for. So I was talking earlier about writing as a white writer might write about where I've come from, but also a lot of people will say I just write for myself, or I'm just expressing myself, and this is a kind of myth that we all inherit. But the truth is we always write for an audience, and anything you read, it's actually very apparent who you write for in what you assume, what you explain, how you write. And in Britain, we can be very lazy about how we articulate our communities and our families, and we also will constantly be doing that anthropological kind of, explaining this is what we eat and this is what we are. And then deeper than that, we'll be making fun as well because of who we're writing for, so we're looking through that gaze. So for me, the journey has partly been a conscious decision, because I was writing for white readers unconsciously earlier, so I've made a decision some years ago that I am going to write for the people I'm writing about, which makes a tremendous difference to my writing. I can assume things. I can't be lazy because, you know, I have to actually know what I'm talking about, the depth and the history and the culture, and everything has to be there because that's a part of people's lives and what they know. A white reader may not see it, but somebody who's from that community will know this is bullshit. So, and then you represent with compassion. So I don't see anything wrong with being critical, but you're going to be critical in a different way, which is about investment and caring, and a way that can lead on to positive things rather than just making fun. This is what we do, we're so funny and weird. So that's been my approach.
It's a really great point when you talk about like writing for a white audience versus writing for a non-white audience. Actually, to the point where when I write my characters, I realise that the book that I'm writing at the moment, the main female character, who's basically living out an even more boring version of my life, was white. For half the way through it, she was a white girl with a white name, and I was like, my God, I'm whitewashing myself. Like it's so inherent, it's so ingrained in us that I'm so used to kind of reading white women, seeing white women, that I can't even write myself as myself. And I had to, obviously, I've changed that and gone back and edited that out and redirected it. Because that is an incredibly valid point, that it's like that it's in my head. I'm like, that's what white people like to read, so I write for that. And I found that when I was writing a lot of journalism, again, when I switched it and I started writing for people of colour, or certainly without worrying about offending white people, I offended a lot of friends who took it very personally. You want to have conversations about when you say white people, I hear me, and I'm like, yeah, that's good, because you're kind of used to that, like you're kind of used to censoring yourselves and everything, and it becomes a very, very difficult thing to break out of, which kind of leads into my something that I still personally kind of struggle with, or that I think about when I'm writing, now that I'm writing with a different audience and a more applicable audience in mind. I'm very aware that I have a responsibility, that when I talk about race, again, intersectionality, where I have a lot of privileges. I'm light-skinned, and I'm, you know, second generation. I was born here, so it's very difficult for me to then, in one sweeping kind of, I can't speak for all, but sometimes I feel like maybe I come across like I am when I write my pieces, and that there is that responsibility to it, where I don't want to fuck up, and I don't want to do that thing where I'm kind of making broad generalizations for people that I know really nothing about, and I can't speak on their lives. And is that something that other people on the panel are aware of when they're writing,
Well, look, I think for me there's two separate sides.
Mm-hmm.
One is when I write fiction. When I'm writing fiction, my only real responsibility is to my characters, and they need to be fully fledged human beings. And I've learned over the last few years, of 2 decades nearly, of writing fiction, that if you're really careful and if you owe your full responsibility to your characters, it's very hard to whitewash them or other them or diminish them, because they kind of take over the page anyway. They're going to sort of push and make sure that they say what they want to say. So that's actually the easiest side for me. I think for me the harder part is when I write non-fiction, and there's multiple issues, and as Bidisha said, it's a larger issue than just publishing or writing, because it is about decolonizing our minds on multiple scales. So it's not just me decolonizing my mind as a writer, but also hoping and trying to do that for my readers. Now, there's another part to decolonization that we don't talk about, that Bidisha mentioned in passing, and that's decolonization. We seem to think is a one-way process, where those from the colonies were suddenly given independence, never won, but were given independence. Think of how we use language, right? And then the British just kind of left and came back and were fine at home. What we don't talk about is how much of the decolonization of the mind must happen here, in the political circles, in the media circles, in that sort of pale male stale circles. Because unless that is done, we're going to be going round and round, and not getting very far. The good side is, of course, as geopolitics take over, as the British power diminishes furthermore, and the island mentality takes over, that decolonization is being forced upon people in this country. In some ways, people of color are kind of one step ahead. We had to deal with it anyway. We've had like a 50-year head start. And that's, I think, something I do take into account. But then it also means in my nonfiction, I will not pull punches. I don't really care. If it's hurtful, great. Maybe you should think about why it hurts. And that's my stance.
Do you ever worry if it's hurtful towards other people of colour? That perhaps maybe you're presenting as speaking on behalf of, but it's only your truth, but maybe other people might read.
I'm very clear that I speak only for
only
myself.
For you.
Yes, I mean, nobody ever says, does Ian McKevin or Julian Barnes speak for every
sure.
white man?
Yeah,
So why
yeah.
should I?
No,
I
absolutely.
speak for me.
For sure.
And funnily enough, I have yet to find that offence coming from another person of colour. Perhaps that's because I have been politically involved since I was a kid, since I was a teenager. I lived in apartheid South Africa, I lived in Namibia, and I was part of the change process. So I am very clear that the solidarity, the South-South solidarity, is very, very different. So I will not demonize, and I will not fall into that white gaze, and I've been very aware of that.
I think what you just said is completely epic, and I love the idea of mutual mental decolonization. You're absolutely right. When I was doing a lot of work on the Middle East, something that Middle East, North African people in the audience kept saying, and it was funny, but it was also true, is that why is it that whenever Middle Eastern women are represented, it's always stock shots of either gotta be young, gotta be beautiful young woman leading one of the revolutionary marches in the Arab country. I hate the word Arab Spring because it's incredibly Orientalist itself, as if the Arab world was asleep before the Arab Spring. That's not the case. Or they want a picture of an older lady in a full thingamy-bob, grieving over the body of her son. They basically want the Virgin Mary crying over the death of Jesus. And those are the two stock images. So it's all about kind of feisty, new, young, revolutionary generation, or suffering, older women suffering, crying. Why? Because they did the best thing in their life, which is the son of the family. And this came up again and again. But I do think that I'm a journalist through and through, and I absolutely believe the written word can change the world. And I think that if you're, not just your heart, but your politics are in the right place, then you can advocate. You can do this thing which is called giving a voice to the voices, which sounds so patronising, it makes me want to puke right now. But the book Asylum and Exile, it's based on I hate promoting books, but it's based on 3 years of outreach work with asylum seekers and refugees from all over the world: Syria, Iran, Iraq, multiple Southern African countries, multiple North African countries, you name it, survivors of torture, rape, and the funniest, smartest people you could ever imagine spent their entire time teasing me and teasing each other. And when I walked in, there was this onslaught of stories, and it wasn't that I was sort of subtly, passive-aggressively, mentally raping people to get a story and then to make a book and help my career. They would say, one guy would go, no, I'll tell you, I won't write it up, I will tell you, and he was really testifying. And he had all sorts of stories, not just about what he left behind, but what it's like being an asylum seeker or refugee in London, not just vilified, but completely invisible. Absolutely invisible, and reading about yourself in the papers in the most vilifying language, or reading about yourself in a very nice paper, which is about dead bodies in boats, hundreds of people dying in boats, but even those people aren't given a name and a face and a history. And I felt good about writing it. I told my students, look, can I write some of this stuff down? You're too funny, I have to write this down, please give me permission. And they did, and there wasn't anything in it. I still work at the same charity. And it's being used, the book is being used by other charities to just say, look, this is not this is not political, it's small, obviously it's political, right, but it's small p political. Yeah. It's just about the daily reality of trying to survive as an asylum seeker, not even a refugee, an asylum seeker in a city. And that's it, and it works, and it feels good to do that.
Yeah, for sure.
I think I really admire the fact that you haven't caused any offence to people of colour so far.
I could have, they haven't told me yet.
Yeah. I haven't quite managed that. I think sometimes we have to challenge our audience, our given audience. I wrote a short story after my first couple of novels that was about shadism. And I remember being at readings and reading this story and people being really, really angry with me that I'd written this story. I didn't really hear it because I was on stage, but when I came off, people came up to me and said, people walked out, people were really angry. And they said, why is he airing our dirty linen in public? And I was airing that dirty linen in public because they were in the audience and I was talking to them about this thing that goes on in our community that I think that we need to have a discussion about. So I think sometimes we do risk causing offence. I feel like that story was written with love. It wasn't pointing the finger at any one particular person, but it was saying, hey, we need to talk about this. And I think it'd be disingenuous for me to solely talk about the ills that come at us from outside our community as well. It's good to talk about the things that are happening within our community, and I feel that we're in a space enough to do that. I mean, I feel like when I read the writers that came before me, when I read, the Beryl Gilroys, the George Lamons, the Sam Selvons, when I read those people, they've dealt with a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, which is not to say that we shouldn't talk about it, but they talked about post-colonialism. And that's a good thing, and like I said, I want to continue to talk about it, but also there's these other things, there's these kind of unspoken stories that are out there that I feel that we need to deal with as well. So yeah, just in short, to answer your question, yeah, I think I'm offending people on both sides of the fence at some point in time. And even with the first novel, with The Scholar, I think that many people in the community were offended by the fact that I had written about people who could be called gangsters. They didn't like that portrayal. But I felt it was an important thing to talk about, and so I did. Yeah.
Because I believe strongly that not only what you write about being political, but the politics of writing. I've been thinking a lot for many years about representation, and I think it is important because so much of what is published, and it's not a coincidence, is very critical and mocking of us through those stereotypes and cliches. So I'd be lying if I said that I don't think about how, I think it depends on context again, and I would think about, negative, positive representation. But I think there is a way of negotiating that by, again, writing with compassion, writing from within, writing three-dimensional characters. Something I've been thinking about more and more is, in my writing, is caste. And that's not something that is very visible in Britain and to Western readers. But if I'm writing about Asian communities, it's very, very important. And so it's something you think about, because you don't, sometimes when you talk about caste in, for example, Britain, it ends up, with a certain kind of audience. There'll be nodding heads and, oh God, those savage people and how they treat their people, you kind of confirm what people already think, and you don't want to do that. But of course you have to write about it because it's a reality and part of our history and our present. So that's something I'm still figuring out, and partly I'm going to write about it, and I am writing about it because I am actually just shutting out. Again, I'm just writing as if I'm writing for the reader, for the people I'm writing about. So I will address those negative aspects. That's
excellent answers. I'm afraid because we're running short on time, I'm going to open it up to you guys to see if you've got any questions that you want to ask. Because we're slightly pushed for time, I'll have to ask that our answers are slightly briefer. I don't want to say that because they're so amazing, but I just want to be able to get in potentially a couple of questions. Anyone who hand in that corner? Yes.
Me?
Yes.
Well, the thing, I think, we need more people to be writing more stuff. And the problem is that writing is a very privileged occupation because it pays so little and it takes up so much time that actually, if you want to make a living at it, it's getting harder and harder and harder, which means we'll have less different sorts of people doing it. And until that's addressed, you know, because you need critical mass, you need lots of different sorts of stories. You don't need, you know, all the same stories all the time. But you're not going to get that because it's harder. If you've got kids, if you're a woman, when are you going to write? You're going to get up early and do that bit of writing before you do all the other shit and you go to your job? It's impossible. So you can't have, if you want to actually be in a position where you're writing, I don't know, a book a year or a book every other year or whatever, or diversifying, you're doing journalism, you're doing whatever, other sorts of writing, it's getting harder and harder to do if you don't have money or a partner with money.
For sure. Yeah.
I just want to this is Catherine Johnson, who I know you're not going to introduce yourself, so I'll do it. Catherine Johnson, a writer, been writing for years, worked in the community. Yeah, you say that.
Who wants to answer that? Does
No,
anyone have an answer to
you're
that?
absolutely right. It's completely, and even more so than journalism, it's absolutely, completely and utterly a privileged situation. You need to be rich to begin with or have a private income. The latest survey showed that novelists on average earn £4,000 a year, which is not a living income in any way, shape or form. You're right, it's incredibly hard. I don't know what the answer is.
No, I don't.
Yeah, I know. No.
But at the same time, I wanted to say that there is I think the idea of making a living as a writer and writing for money can be really problematic as well. And
Why is he going to do it? No, excuse me, that's what you do it for. It's a job. For me, it's a craft and it's a job. And you tell the best stories you can. But if you're not doing it for money, when are you going to do it? What are you doing? The other...
No,
Can't sit on a cloud.
I agree with you, but I just want to say that because of if you're writing for money, then there's so many pressures that to write certain kind of stories. It's you end up writing for commission. You end up what you write about and how you write often ends up getting dictated by others, funding bodies. You end up performing rather than writing what you want to write.
I do understand that point as well, that sometimes that you also if you're writing if someone is paying you and then they edit it a certain way, then that removes that removes your say, or that you are already having to tailor it to a certain audience. So I do understand that, but I think you're completely right. Like we're absolutely fucked, and we are just, you know, we're not. I disagree. I disagree in the sense that we're not privileged in that, like, we work a lot of other jobs and that doesn't, you know, and there. But I hear what you're saying, because if I didn't have parents who could take me in a heartbeat, if I couldn't pay my bills, would I take this risk and do it? No. I know that I work other jobs and I've done shitty jobs in order to do this, but if I didn't have parents who had open arms to take me in, I probably wouldn't be able to give this a risk. And I think you're absolutely right in that sense.
Can I just say, I think there's something sort of quite noble in being able to write from the heart. I mean, you know, for money, and to actually be like, but at least I think there's something quite. It's because it's a craft as well as an art, I think.
I think this is what irritates people in mainstream media as well, because they come fresh out of kind of Oxbridge and they go straight into writing the same generic shit that they're all saying, and you kind of, and then it's with platforms like Media Diversified where I read so many amazing, really actually skillfully, really well written articles, not just that the points are valuable, but actually the skill and the craft is really impressive. And then you open the Guardian and you're like, wow, like, whose son are you? Because you can't write. Like, this is really, really bad. And it's getting worse. I mean, The Independent's turned into BuzzFeed. I mean, everything is just, it's so awful at the moment that I completely agree with you, and I don't know what the answer is. I wish I had an answer, because I'd have a much nicer, richer life if I had the answer to that. Yes, question here. Yeah.
My question is about book reviewers and literature critics. I know that Media Diversified has just started up the arts and culture section, and I want to know what you think the relationship between writers and critics should be in order to encourage nuance in literature reviews for audiences who haven't actually read your writing yet.
Sure. Hannah?
Can you repeat the question? Over the microphone.
Will that work?
No. It's about the relationship between authors, critics, and book reviewing.
Well, strange question. I don't know if you've seen, and I would recommend looking at a report called Writing the Future, which was actually just released during the London Book Fair, and it's absolutely depressing because it looks at the lack of diversity and how it's gotten worse over the last last 10 years in this country. And they looked at publishing, reviewing, so on. There are multiple reports and statistics that women writers are reviewed less, and that's white women writers. Women reviewers get fewer spots on the book pages. Of course, when you add race and sexuality and all the other elements to it, the numbers get even worse. Actually, it's quite depressing. I have to be very honest. Before my new novel came out, I was very clear that I was not expecting any mainstream press to pick it up. I do not expect a reviewer to read it. I do not expect Guardian and Independent and so on to read. If the book reviewers, and this is where it's a slightly contentious point, the best book reviews are actually coming from the bloggers. They are passionate about it, they're interested, they have a community, they really desperately want to be part of the book world. Now, the sad part is, of course, as a book blogger, kind of picking up on that point before, you're not getting paid. I met this extraordinary book blogger a few weeks ago who does, religiously posts reviews every day. Her day job is working at Tesco stacking shelves. This is a woman with an extraordinary mind who does not have a place to be writing the reviews, which are informed, they're very, very well crafted. And that is really a symptom for me of a broken system. Now, that also, one of the things that came out from that report is the so-called, the BME market is worth about $3 billion a year. Most publishers aren't accessing it, neither are the newspapers. So when I pick up the Guardian, I don't pay for Guardian. I will look at their website, I will check certain stories and move on, because I don't respect that. I don't respect what I'm receiving from it. I will actually pitch for Media Diversified, frankly, even though I've only written 2 pieces for them. And I'll pay. But I think that's actually a place that does give that platform. And the sad part is, of course, that if instead of being Media Diversified, run by women of color, if it was a media startup like Vox or Vice or BuzzFeed, they would be rolling in cash by now, and that's the sad part of it. So I personally think we really need to start putting our money where our mouth is and start actually supporting the platforms, because otherwise we're never going to get through those doors. So why bother?
I was going to wrap up shortly. There's one last.
Have some of your juice.
It's wine, so I don't know if she's going to. We're going to have one last. I know I meant to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but Meg now has a question she's had her hand for a little while. So if you want to ask that, we just keep it kind of next couple of minutes, and we'll wrap up.
So basically, I wanted to ask you, as writers who aren't white, what's been your experience if you've ever written a white character and how you felt about it? Because I'm a filmmaker, and sometimes I'm aghast at how conflicted I am by my own validity to portray someone white. It's a really complicated feeling. So
I can pull that up if you don't mind. Sorry for taking it up. A few years ago, I actually wrote a story, a short story that was set in the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War, and the main character is white and a survivor of the Civil War, and it was a very weird process for me to try and write. Now, the first thing, of course, I realized was how much my own location as a writer of color impacted. So I speak Spanish. I did my PhD in Barcelona. I know the city inside out. I still then went out and interviewed more people. I spent lots of time talking to everyone I could think of, and then ran the draft multiple times, through Spanish and Catalan friends, going, do you think I'm doing this okay? And of course, even as I was doing it, I realized that This never happens. Now, people write about India all the time. Nobody actually cares. You know, I have a theory that if I wrote a book about how Indian women are represented, we'd call them princesses, IS, victims, and that's it. Those would be our archetypes, because that's what we end up being. Oh, by the way, and prostitutes. We do very well with that. So those are 4 archetypes, and in each case they have to be saved. But I was very aware that if I was not going to do what had been done to me. So that's my only answer.
I feel like the publishing world is a little bit behind the world that comes to an event like this, or even the general media, or the world of political activists. So actually our conversations about race and multiculturalism are really, they're coming along, they're quite advanced. But once you're in publishing, suddenly it gets into lockdown. So my first novel, which I wrote when I was like 3 or whatever, came out, and I didn't mention anything about the characters' races, none whatsoever. I didn't even think about it, and again, I'm sure that's because of the internalization that we talk about. I don't even know how I imagined the central character being. It's sort of, it didn't even occur to me. That's how deep it went. And I was always, I thought I was political, obviously, you know, political to the core, and yet I didn't mention it. And every single interviewer and reviewer said, but what have you got to say about race? And I was like, what I have to say about race is that racism is bad and don't do it, and I'm the victim, not the perpetrator, so this is your problem, so deal with it yourself. I didn't say that, I was much more polite than that, but they were really had like a stick up their butt about, why isn't this novel about race? It's by a brown person. Doesn't she know she's brown? Doesn't she like see it in the mirror every single day, and like doesn't it torment her 24 hours a day? And they were really angry about it. Meanwhile, you take it out into the rest of the world, people who don't work in publishing, they're not critics, they're not interviewers, and it was taken at face value. So yes, there's this sort of obsession that if you are red, black, yellow, brown, like one of the majority of people on this planet, you're going to deal with that. And not only that, but it's going to bother you all the time, and you're already angry about it specifically. Whereas I always feel like saying, this is not our problem, this is the problem of perpetrators. We are not the perpetrators. But yeah, so there's an obsession with it.
I'm really sorry to have to end this, because this is actually, it's not only so interesting, but so valuable and so well informed. That I could carry on talking about this for years. In fact, you could probably follow any of us on Twitter and you'll just get this 24 hours a day anyway. But just sorry for running over, but I hope you enjoyed it and valued it as much as we did. I'd like to say a massive thank you to our panel, Sunny Singh, Bidisha, Courttia Newland and Kavita, who are both of and a massive thank you to Media Diversified, who are absolutely incredible.
Goodbye number 1. Goodbye number 2. Goodbye number 3. Goodbye number 4. Hold up your hand if you love her, then your fashion and style. There is a posse in the corner, all of them just a ball of murder. But let me hear you say